Earl Mitchell was born on a cold morning in late December when the snow layered itself over the endless cornfields of Iowa, burying the brown earth under a thick white blanket. His father had been up since before dawn, making rounds to the barns and checking on the cattle, watching the sky for signs of an approaching storm. By the time the midwife arrived, the storm had settled in, and the small farmhouse shook under the weight of wind and snow. The story of his birth became something like a family legend, told and retold as evidence of how the land seemed to weave itself into his life from the very first breath he drew. When he was old enough to understand, his father explained that this land was more than soil and fence posts. It was the story of their family. It was the reason his grandfather had left everything behind to carve out a life on the prairie, and it was the reason his father worked from sunup to sundown without complaint. Earl's earliest memories were of soil and sweat. He remembered following his father through fields that seemed endless when he was small, carrying a coffee can full of seeds and dropping them into the furrows as instructed. He remembered the feel of warm earth under bare feet, the rough calluses on his father's hands when he lifted him onto a tractor seat, the smell of diesel and dirt that lingered on his clothes. There were no vacations, no summer camps, no faraway adventures. The adventures were in watching a seed sprout, in checking the height of corn stalks with a measuring tape that belonged to his grandfather, in walking fence lines to mend breaks before the cattle discovered the weakness. When the school bell rang, he was in class. When it stopped, he was in the field. Not because he had to be, but because he wanted to be near his father, because he liked the feeling of contributing to something that seemed older than any of them. The stories his father told him were not bedtime stories with dragons or knights. They were stories of the land, of the drought in the 50s when his father had hauled water from the creek in barrels to keep the cattle alive. They were stories of storms that ripped roofs from barns, of neighbors coming together to rebuild without being asked, of winter nights when snowdrifts were so high that only the tops of the fence posts could be seen. There was a rhythm to these stories, a cadence that matched the seasons. Spring was about hope. It was about planting and faith in rain. Summer was about work, long days under the unforgiving sun. Fall was about reward, the harvest, the satisfaction of seeing grain bins filled. Winter was about endurance, about surviving the cold and the dark and remembering that spring would come again. His father taught him to read the sky. A dark line of clouds on the horizon could mean hail that would shred corn leaves in minutes. A sudden stillness in the air could mean a tornado forming in the distance. The smell of rain could arrive before the first drop fell. Earl learned to listen to birds and insects, to know by the sound of cicadas when the heat would break, to watch the behavior of cattle for signs of approaching weather. He learned to read soil the way other people read books, by feeling its moisture with his fingers, by smelling it, by knowing if it had enough organic matter to hold the roots of young plants. When he was 10, his father took him to the back field, far from the road, and pointed to a patch of land. "This is your first field," he said, handing him a bag of seed. Earl did not hear the sentence as a gift or challenge. He heard it as a bond. That spring, he planted that field by hand, row after row of soybeans, following the lines his father had made with the tractor. He learned to cultivate his own rows, to pull the weeds that would steal moisture from the seedlings, to check the beans for aphids and treat them if necessary. When the soybeans turned from green to yellow and the leaves fell, he harvested them with a small combine, his father watching from a few rows away. The yield was modest, but the feeling of standing beside a wagon full of beans he had grown with his own hands planted something deeper than seeds. It planted a commitment. The farm itself was a patchwork of fields that his grandfather had purchased after the Second World War. Some were flat and rich, producing corn so tall that you could get lost in it if you left the row. Others were hilly and rocky, better suited for pasture. There were sections where the soil was dark black, a foot deep, rich with decomposed prairie grasses, and other sections where clay was just below the surface, heavy and unforgiving. The house sat on a slight rise, its porch overlooking fields that stretched out to the horizon. The barns were red, the paint faded in places, the roofs patched with tin where storms had done their worst. The farmyard was a mix of old vehicles, new machinery, and the occasional dog sleeping in the shade. It might not have been picture perfect, but to Earl, it was everything. When people asked why his father stayed, why he did not sell the farm during the drought or the hard times when commodity prices fell, his father would shrug and look at the soil. "I don't own this land," he would say quietly. "It owns me." It was not a romantic notion. It was a recognition of the responsibility he felt to steward the soil, to leave it better than he found it, to respect the sacrifices his own father had made to buy and hold on to it. This idea of stewardship would become one of the guiding principles of Earl's life. You did not simply extract from the land. You worked with it, cared for it, and in return, it taught you patience, humility, and endurance. By the time he was 18, Earl knew that he did not want to leave. While many of his classmates talked about going to college in cities or joining the military, he felt an anchor in the soil. He had watched friends move away and come back for holidays, their hands softer, their conversation different. Some never returned at all. He did not judge them. Everyone had to find his own path. His was a path through rows of corn, across frozen fields in the winter, around the edges of creeks that flooded in the spring. There was no glamour in it. There was hard work, unpredictable weather, long hours, and constant worry about markets and prices and equipment breakdowns. But there was also something intangible that made it worth it. The feeling of watching a field you planted turn green, the satisfaction of working alongside your father, the quiet of a winter morning when the snow muffled every sound except the crunch of your boots. When he graduated from high school, his father handed him a check that represented every extra penny his parents had saved. It was not a large sum, but it was enough to make a down payment on a piece of land, a small quarter section that adjoined the farm. "This is your start," his father said. "If you want to go to college, this will help. If you want to farm, this will be the beginning of your own piece. Either way, it is yours." Earl looked at the check and looked at the fields and the barns and the house that had always been there. He did not hesitate. He told his father he wanted to buy that adjoining quarter, and together they met with the man who owned it and signed the papers. In that moment, he began a journey that would span 50 years on the same soil. Earl did not know then what those 50 years would bring. He could not have predicted the droughts, the floods, the market collapses, the technological changes, or the personal joys and sorrows that would shape his life. He only knew that he wanted to be part of something larger than himself, something grounded and real. His father smiled at his decision, not because he thought farming was easy, but because he knew what it meant to find your place early and commit to it. The day Earl signed the deed, his father took him back to the field he had given him at 10 years old. They walked the rows together, talking about crop rotations, soil health, and the neighbors who had taught them both how to farm. Earl did not know it then, but that day would mark the beginning of a lifelong apprenticeship with the land itself, an education that no college could offer, taught by seasons and storms and soil. Looking back, Earl would later understand that those early years were about laying foundations, not just in buildings but in character. Watching his father work instilled in him a respect for labor and a disdain for shortcuts. Hearing stories of neighbors coming to each other's aid taught him the value of community. Feeling the failure of a crop due to early frost taught him humility and the limits of control. Celebrating a bountiful harvest taught him gratitude. Being handed a check with no conditions taught him trust and responsibility. All of these lessons were rooted in the soil. They were absorbed through his hands as he planted and harvested, through his ears as he listened to his father and neighbors, through his eyes as he watched the seasons change. He would come to see that while he chose the farm also chose him. The land held him when he was overwhelmed, grounded him when the wider world seemed chaotic, and educated him in ways that extended beyond yield per acre or commodity prices. It taught him to pay attention, to work hard even when no one was watching, to care for living things, to prepare for drought even when it had been raining for weeks, to celebrate and then move on because there was always another task waiting. These were the beginnings of a lifetime of lessons from the land. They would shape his character, his relationships, and the decisions he made at every stage of his life. They would form the backdrop of the story of how one farmer spent 50 years on the same soil and learned about life in a way that only the land can teach. When Earl was in his early 20s, his days followed a pattern that most outsiders would find grueling. He woke before dawn to tend to livestock, checked on calves in winter and piglets in spring, then moved to the fields as soon as daylight allowed. He learned to read the calendar not by months or holidays, but by tasks. Planting in April and May, cultivating in June and July, harvesting in September and October, repairing machinery in November and December. The farm did not care if it was a weekend or a holiday. Cows still needed to be milked. Calves still needed to be bottle-fed. Fences still needed mending. While his former classmates were attending football games or parties or exploring cities, Earl was under tractors, replacing bearings or knee-deep in mud, pulling a calf during a difficult birth. Those early years tested him physically and mentally. He learned how to fix equipment with baling wire and ingenuity, how to adjust a carburetor by sound, how to weld broken implements in a way that would hold through a season. His father showed him how to lay out a field so that water drained properly, how to use contour lines to prevent erosion, how to rotate crops to maintain soil health. He taught him why the timing of planting could mean the difference between a crop that matured before the first frost and one that died in the field. Earl listened, asked questions, and made mistakes. He planted too early one spring and watched frost kill half his stand. He planted too late another year and fought mud all harvest. His father did not scold him. He let the consequences teach. In those years, Earl also learned the language of markets. He discovered that the price of corn or soybeans was not just about what he produced, but about what was happening in distant countries he would never visit. A drought in Argentina could raise prices in Iowa. A change in government policy could lower them. He learned to read futures contracts, to decide whether to sell ahead or wait to lock in a price when he thought it was favorable. He made mistakes there too, selling too soon and watching prices climb, waiting too long and watching them fall. His father reminded him that no one could predict markets perfectly. The goal was not to maximize every cent, but to make decisions that kept the farm solvent and stable. Stability, his father said, was more important than speculation. Community played a significant role in these apprenticeship years. The farmers around them were not competitors, they were allies. When a neighbor's barn caught fire, Earl and his father dropped everything to help. When Earl's tractor broke down at harvest time, the neighbor loaned him his own. In the off-season, farmers gathered at the local feed store or church basement to swap stories and share tips. They talked about new seed varieties, about the yield differences between no-till and conventional tillage, about the best way to keep raccoons out of the corn crib. They argued good-naturedly about whether John Deere or International Harvester made better tractors, about whether hogs or cattle were more profitable. These conversations were part of the informal education that no book could provide. Earl married during these years. He met Anna at a church picnic. She was the daughter of a local teacher, quiet but quick-witted, with eyes that seemed to understand the weight that rested on Earl's shoulders. They courted between chores, walking along the fence lines in the evening, sharing sandwiches in the cab of a tractor during long planting days. Anna understood that marriage to a farmer meant sharing him with the land. She learned to cook for harvest crews, to drive a tractor when needed, to keep the farm books balanced when times were tight. They built a home on the land he had bought with his father's help, a modest house with a wide porch where they could watch summer storms roll in and winter sunsets paint the snow pink. Marriage added new layers to Earl's apprenticeship. He learned to balance the demands of the farm with the needs of his wife. He discovered that what the land taught him about patience and endurance applied equally to relationships. He and Anna faced hardships together. Their first child, a daughter, was born in a year of drought. Water was scarce, tempers were frayed, finances were tight. They took turns hauling water for the livestock, and at night they took turns walking the floor with a colicky infant. The stress could have pulled them apart, but it didn't. It bound them. They learned to communicate with a look, to find humor in exhaustion, to celebrate small victories like a gentle rain or a healthy calf. Their son was born 3 years later, during a year of abundance when the barns were full and the bins were overflowing. They named him after Anna's father. The joy of his birth was tempered by the awareness that abundance could shift to scarcity in a heartbeat. They saved and paid down debt. They invested in tile drainage for the low fields that flooded every spring. They built a new machine shed to protect equipment from the elements. Every decision was weighed against the knowledge that good years were gifts, not guarantees. As the children grew, Earl and Anna taught them the way Earl's father had taught him, through stories, work, and example. They gave them small tasks appropriate for their age, praising effort more than results. The children learned to gather eggs, to feed bottle lambs, to ride on the combine in harvest. They learned that fun could be found in the everyday rhythms of the farm, making forts in hay bales, sliding down gravel piles, swimming in the creek after chores were done. Earl watched his son drop seeds into furrows, just as he had done at that age, and felt the weight of continuity. He watched his daughter prefer animals to tractors, and he encouraged her to pursue whatever dreams she had, farm-related or not. It was during these apprenticeship years that the land began to teach him about humility. He had early successes that made him think he had figured out the secrets of high yields. One spring, he planted earlier than anyone else, gambled on a warm April, and was rewarded with a bumper crop. He told himself he had outsmarted the weather. The next year he tried the same thing, and a late frost wiped out the early planting. Humility came from leaning into the fact that so much was out of his control. He could do everything right and still suffer from a storm. He could make mistakes and be saved by a stretch of perfect weather. The land taught him that his control was partial, that he was a partner, not a master. Patience was another lesson. Crops did not grow overnight. Trees planted along fence lines took years to provide shade. Soil health improved slowly, with cover crops and careful management. Earl sometimes found himself frustrated at how long improvements took. He wanted to see results now. Then remembered the story his father told him about his grandfather planting walnut trees that he knew he would never harvest. "You plant for the next generation," his father had said. "Not everything is for your benefit." Over time, Earl began to appreciate the slow pace of the farm. He learned that patience was not just a virtue, but a necessity if you wanted to thrive on the land. Endurance was tested in countless ways. Long hours during harvest would leave his muscles aching and his eyes burning from dust, but there were wagons to fill and elevators to deliver to before they closed. Early mornings in winter required breaking ice in stock tanks with an axe, even when the wind chill was 20 below. He learned to keep going even when tired because livestock depended on him. When storms flattened half his corn one year, he harvested by picking up the stalks by hand. He and Anna would work side by side, their gloves soaked from dew, their backs sore. Yet they pushed through because giving up was not an option. Endurance meant showing up day after day, regardless of mood or motivation, trusting that the cumulative effect of consistent effort would pay off. During these years, the farm crisis of the 1980s hit. Prices fell, interest rates skyrocketed, and many farmers around them lost their land. Foreclosure sales became common. Earl attended some of them, not to buy equipment, but to support neighbors who were watching generations of work being sold to the highest bidder. He saw grown men cry. He saw families move off farms they had assumed they would pass to their children. He saw the underbelly of an industry that romanticized independence but often hid the crushing reality of debt and volatility. Earl and his father had always avoided excessive leverage. They had paid off loans quickly, deferred purchases until they could pay cash, and as a result, they weathered the crisis, but it was not without cost. They cut expenses to the bone, drove equipment longer than they should have, and took off farm jobs in the winter to bring in extra income. Earl hauled grain for other farmers and fixed machinery in his shop for a fee. Anna took a part-time job at the local bank, balancing ledgers. They survived, but the crisis left scars. It reinforced Earl's belief in living within your means and reminded him that the land could only insulate you so much from wider economic forces. When the crisis passed and prosperity slowly returned, Earl did not forget its lessons. He taught his children not just how to grow crops, but how to manage money, how to avoid debt, how to plan for lean years, even in the midst of abundance. He explained that the farm was not just about physical work. It was about decisions, risk management, and long-term thinking. He and Anna celebrated small milestones, paying off the mortgage, buying a new combine without taking a loan, seeing their children graduate from high school. They celebrated not with extravagance, but with quiet satisfaction, maybe a new coat of paint on the barn, or a small trip to the county fair as a family. Through these years of apprenticeship, the land continued to be his teacher. It taught through seasons and cycles, through successes and failures, through community and solitude. It taught him to work with others, to accept help when it was offered, to offer help without expecting anything in return. It taught him that marriage and family were not separate from farming but part of the same fabric. It taught him that endurance, humility, patience, and resilience were not abstract concepts, but daily practices. Most importantly, it taught him that learning never ended. He might have mastered certain tasks, but there was always a new challenge, a new technique, a new problem to solve. As he entered his 30s, Earl began to shift from student to steward, not because he knew everything, but because he recognized his responsibility to care for the land, not just for himself, but for the future. The third decade on the farm brought with it a series of storms, both literal and figurative, that tested Earl's resolve in new ways. Weather patterns shifted unpredictably. One year, a late spring blizzard blanketed emerging corn, forcing replanting at great expense. Another year, a heat wave baked the soil, stunting soybean growth. These environmental extremes were not just inconvenient. They were existential threats to a farm that depended on predictable patterns. Earl responded by adopting conservation practices he had once considered unnecessary. He planted cover crops to hold soil during heavy rains, invested in minimum tillage to preserve moisture, and explored drought-resistant seed varieties. The land taught him adaptability, not in abandoning tradition, but in integrating new knowledge with old wisdom. Change also came in the form of technology. Tractors grew larger and more powerful, equipped with GPS systems that could plant corn within an inch of a predetermined line. Yield monitors provided real-time data that allowed him to adjust fertilizer rates on the fly. Drones appeared over neighbors' fields, capturing images that revealed nutrient deficiencies invisible to the naked eye. At first, Earl resisted. He had learned to drive a tractor by listening to the engine and feeling the soil through the seat. The idea of trusting a computer to steer or determine seeding rates seemed foolish. But his son, who had returned from college with a degree in agronomy, saw the potential. He showed Earl how GPS could reduce overlap, saving seed and fuel. He demonstrated how variable rate technology could improve yields while reducing fertilizer runoff into streams. Reluctantly at first, and then with growing enthusiasm, Earl integrated these technologies. He discovered that technology did not replace experience. It enhanced it. GPS could not tell you everything. Sensors might show a problem area, but you still had to walk the field and dig into the soil to understand why it was struggling. Drones could spot a stressed area, but only a farmer with decades of knowledge could interpret whether it was due to compaction, disease, or poor drainage. Earl's skepticism turned into curiosity. He attended workshops on precision agriculture, subscribed to agronomy journals, and spent evenings discussing soil maps with his son. These conversations were not just about yields, they were about stewardship. Technology, he realized, could help him care for the land more effectively, applying nutrients precisely where needed, minimizing waste, and reducing environmental impact. The storms were not limited to weather and technology. Personal storms arrived with suddenness and ferocity. When Earl was 45, his father died unexpectedly from a heart attack during corn harvest. They had been working side by side just hours earlier, laughing at a joke about the old tractor refusing to start on cold mornings. His father had complained of indigestion, waved off Earl's suggestion to take a break, and kept working. By the time Earl realized something was wrong, it was too late. The loss hit him harder than any drought or flood. For the first time, the farm felt empty despite the acres and tasks that filled every day. Earl looked out over fields they had walked together and felt an ache that came from knowing he would never again hear his father's advice on when to plant or how deep to set the plow. Grief changed him. It made him more reflective. In the months following his father's death, every chore seemed to carry a memory. Fixing a fence became an exercise in remembering the day his father taught him to stretch wire tight. Feeding cattle on a cold morning triggered the memory of his father remarking on how steam rose from their backs. Earl had always known intellectually that his time with his father was finite, but the reality of loss pushed that knowledge into his bones. It made him realize that he would not always be there for his own children, that his knowledge and values would need to be passed intentionally. In the evenings, he began writing down stories his father had told him, lessons he had learned, and advice he wanted his children to carry. Anna encouraged him. Their kids listened, sometimes rolling their eyes at repetition, but the story stuck. Personal storms also tested his marriage. The stress of running a farm, raising children, and dealing with grief sometimes manifested as short tempers or emotional distance. Earl and Anna found themselves snapping at each other over small things, like how long to let a field dry before planting or which bills to pay first. It would have been easy to let those tensions fester. Instead, they leaned into the lessons the land had taught them: patience, endurance, and communication. They had learned that ignoring a problem in a field did not make it go away. It often made it worse. The same was true of relationships. They scheduled time to talk, not about logistics or chores, but about fears, hopes, and frustrations. They took short walks after dinner, leaving the children to finish chores and use that time to reconnect. Slowly, they navigated through the storm and emerged with a deeper understanding of each other. Financial storms came as well. The early 2000s brought volatile commodity markets. Prices swung wildly based on trade policies, weather reports, and global demand. Earl and Anna had always followed a conservative financial strategy, but even they felt the whiplash. In one year, corn prices were high enough to pay off equipment loans. The next year, they barely covered expenses. Inputs like seed, fertilizer, and fuel rose steadily. Healthcare costs increased as they aged. The farm provided a living, but there were years when it seemed like more money was flowing out than in. Earl revisited the lessons of the farm crisis, diversifying their income by raising specialty crops like food-grade soybeans for a niche market and direct marketing grass-finished beef to local restaurants. He learned that resilience involved not just enduring storms, but innovating within them. These storms of change were not events Earl would have chosen, but they deepened his relationship with the land. He found that grief sharpened his awareness of beauty. A sunrise over frosted fields seemed more precious after losing his father. The smell of fresh-cut hay carried an undercurrent of memory. The laughter of his children running through sprinklers in the yard on a hot July day felt like a blessing. He began to appreciate the way the land held history. He could look at a particular tree and remember watching his father plant it. He could stand in a field and see himself at 10, planting soybeans in rows his father had laid out. The land became a repository of memory, a living record of the people who had walked it and the events that had unfolded there. This chapter of his life also taught him that strength and vulnerability were not opposites but partners. Strength meant showing up every day, working hard, making decisions. Vulnerability meant admitting when you were scared, asking for help, grieving openly. The land seemed to reflect this lesson. It was strong enough to support crops year after year, yet vulnerable to erosion if not cared for. It was fertile when managed wisely, yet depleted if abused. Earl learned that being a good farmer meant balancing those two realities, both in soil management and in life. He allowed himself to mourn his father openly. He accepted help from neighbors when he could not bring in harvest alone that first year after the funeral. He talked to his children about his fear of failing them, and they responded with understanding rather than judgment. As he embraced new technology and confronted personal and financial storms, Earl discovered that adaptation did not mean abandoning core values. He still believed in hard work, in honesty, in community. He still prayed over his meals and asked for rain when the skies were too clear. He still stood by his commitments even when commodity prices fell. But he also learned to let go of rigidity. He became comfortable with learning from his children, from younger farmers who came with ideas he had not considered. He learned that listening was a form of respect, and that wisdom sometimes came from unexpected sources. By the time this stormy chapter began to settle, Earl found himself in his early 50s. His children were grown, with dreams of their own. His daughter pursued a career in veterinary medicine, returning occasionally to help with calving. His son took over more of the farm management, bringing his agronomy knowledge to decisions about planting and fertilizing. Earl felt a shift that both comforted and unsettled him. The farm was still his life, but he was no longer the sole decision-maker. He had to trust that the lessons he had tried to impart would guide his son. He had to learn the delicate art of stepping back without disengaging. The storms of change taught Earl that life on the land was not static. It evolved, sometimes violently, sometimes quietly. To remain on the same soil for decades, he had to be both rooted and flexible, grounded in values, but adaptable in practice. He had to accept that grief would visit him, that technology would challenge him, that finances would ebb and flow, and that relationships would require cultivation just like crops. Each storm left its mark, eroding some things, depositing rich silt in other areas. In the end, these changes deepened his understanding of the land and of himself. He came to see the storms not as interruptions, but as part of the natural cycle, necessary for growth and renewal. As Earl looked toward the future, he felt a quiet confidence that came from having weathered storms and learned from them. He knew more storms would come. Droughts would return, markets would dip, loved ones would age and depart. But he also knew that the land had taught him how to endure, how to adapt, and how to draw strength from the very soil under his feet. The storms of change had not weakened him. They had carved deeper channels through which resilience could flow. In the fourth decade of Earl's life on the farm, the lessons shifted from apprenticeship and adaptation to deeper reflections on loss and renewal. This was the decade when Earl and Anna faced the heartbreak of losing their eldest daughter. She died suddenly in a car accident on a gravel road not far from the farm. It was the kind of event that shattered time, dividing life into before and after, into light and shadow. One moment she had been home, laughing with her brother about his decision to paint the new machine shed a shade of green that did not match anything else on the farm. The next moment she was gone. The funeral drew people from miles around. Neighbors and extended family filled the small church to overflowing. Earl stood beside Anna in the receiving line, feeling numb as dozens of people hugged them, offered casseroles, and repeated words of comfort that washed over him without registering. The burial took place on a hill overlooking the farm. As they lowered his daughter's casket into the ground, Earl thought about all the times he had watched seeds disappear into soil, trusting they would sprout. He wondered how something as final as burial could lead to anything but emptiness. For months after, the farm felt different. Fields that had always seemed full of life now seemed haunted by absence. Earl could not walk past the house without expecting to see his daughter leaning against the railing, her hair blowing in the wind. He could not hear laughter in the kitchen without remembering hers. The routines of farm life continued. Calves were born, crops were planted, equipment broke and needed fixing, but a sadness hovered over everything. Earl found himself questioning the fairness of a world where a 27-year-old woman could die while an old farmer like him kept going. Anna withdrew into herself, moving through days with a quiet that was not peace but exhaustion. The land became a place of solace and reflection during this time. When words failed, Earl found comfort in the familiar tasks. His hands knew how to open gates, how to check fences, how to grease a combine. Those tasks provided a rhythm when grief threatened to overwhelm. He would walk to the back field in the evenings, sit on a rock overlooking the creek, and listen to the wind in the cottonwoods. The sound was the same as it had been when he was a boy. It reminded him that life continued, that the seasons turned whether or not he wanted them to. The corn grew even when his heart ached. The sun rose even when he wanted to stay in bed. The land did not ask him to be okay. It simply was. In those solitary walks, Earl began to see a connection between farming and grieving. Both involved tending, waiting, and trusting. You planted seeds not knowing if they would germinate. You buried your child not knowing if you could ever feel joy again. Both required faith that something unseen would emerge from darkness. He did not find answers in the fields, but he found space to hold his grief. He found that the act of tending to animals and plants reminded him of the act of caring for his family. He found that the discipline of showing up every day, even when he did not want to, provided a structure that kept him moving. Anna found her own solace. She spent hours in the garden, planting flowers that she said made her think of their daughter. She baked bread and left loaves on neighbors' porches, finding comfort in feeding others. She joined a support group for parents who had lost children, driving into town once a week to sit in a circle with strangers who understood her pain. Earl sometimes went with her, sitting quietly, listening to stories that were different yet similar. They both learned that grief was not something you got over. It was something you learned to live with, like a scar that pulls tight in certain weather. They learned that while the pain lessened with time, the love remained, and that love could be expressed in ways that honored their daughter. They established a scholarship at the local high school in her name so that other young women could pursue their dreams. They dedicated a bench overlooking the creek where she had loved to walk. Through this experience, Earl gained a deeper appreciation for the community that farming fostered. People showed up with food, with offers to help with chores, with stories of his daughter that he had never heard. Men he had known all his life, but with whom he had never discussed emotions, hugged him with tears in their eyes. Women who had buried their own children wrote letters describing how they survived the first year. The community did not fix his pain, but it lessened his sense of isolation. It reminded him that they were part of something larger than themselves. This decade also brought renewal. After years of working with her father, Earl's daughter's absence left a gap on the farm. His son, who had been considering starting his own operation, decided to stay and take on more responsibilities. He brought energy and ideas that Earl welcomed. They sat at the kitchen table, maps spread out, discussing drainage improvements, soil sampling, and cover crop mixes. Earl recognized that his son's desire to innovate was not a rejection of tradition, but an extension of stewardship. They built a new barn using solar panels to power its ventilation. They installed a water recycling system for their cattle operation. These projects were not just about efficiency, they were about commitment to leaving the land better than they found it. Working together on these projects gave Earl and his son a shared purpose that helped them process their grief. Renewal also came in the form of grandchildren. Earl and Anna became grandparents when their son's first child was born. Holding a newborn in the farmhouse where his children had grown made Earl feel a circle closing. He watched his son rock the baby in the same chair where he had rocked him decades earlier. He saw Anna smile through tears. The presence of a new life did not erase the absence of their daughter, but it introduced joy that had been missing. Their granddaughter grew up playing in the same yard, riding on the same tractors, feeding the same chickens that Earl had cared for. As she grew, she became curious about the farm. She followed Earl around, asking why the corn grew taller in some rows than others, why chickens laid eggs at certain times of day, why the creek flooded some springs and not others. Her questions made him see the farm with fresh eyes. Explaining it to her forced him to articulate things he had known intuitively. In doing so, he realized how much knowledge he carried that was worth sharing. The land itself provided a form of renewal. After years of careful management, the soil improved. Organic matter increased. Earthworms became more plentiful. The yields stabilized. The creek banks, which had been eroded by runoff in his youth, were reinforced with native grasses that held soil and provided habitat for wildlife. Trees planted in his 20s were now tall enough to provide shade for cattle and shelter for migrating birds. When he walked the farm, he could see the cumulative effect of decisions made over decades. It gave him a sense of satisfaction that came not from one big success, but from 1,000 small choices. In this period of loss and renewal, Earl learned that the land mirrored the human experience. Just as fields lay fallow to recover, so too did hearts need rest after grief. Just as pruning promoted growth in trees, so too did letting go of certain expectations make room for new possibilities. He learned that renewal did not mean forgetting. It meant integrating the past into a new reality. He found that honoring his daughter's memory through action, by caring for the land, by sharing knowledge, by supporting others in grief, helped transform pain into purpose. This chapter deepened his spiritual connection to the land. He began to see farming as a form of prayer. Every time he planted a seed, he was acknowledging trust in something beyond himself. Every time he cared for soil, he was participating in creation. Every time he harvested, he was celebrating abundance while recognizing its source. He found comfort in passages from the Bible that spoke of seasons, sowing and reaping, mourning and dancing. He whispered prayers while walking fence lines, thanking God for rain, asking for strength, expressing gratitude for community. The land became a sacred text, revealing truths about life, death, and renewal. By the end of this decade, Earl and Anna had reached their 60s. They had gray hair and creaky joints. They had lines on their faces etched by laughter and tears. They had suffered deep loss, yet they had found ways to continue. They understood that life did not offer guarantees. They knew that joy and sorrow could coexist. They knew that the land they had stewarded for decades was both temporary and timeless. It would outlast them, but their fingerprints would remain in its soil and in the lives of those they had touched. The lesson of this chapter was not that time healed all wounds. Time, Earl discovered, did not heal so much as it changed the relationship to pain. The land taught him that after a fire, green shoots eventually appear. After winter, spring comes. After planting, harvest follows. The cycles did not erase the past. They offered context. They reminded him that renewal was possible, not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a continuation of life's unfolding story. He learned that the land was a keeper of memories, a place where sorrow could be honored and joy could be cultivated. In caring for the soil, he cared for his own heart. In planting trees he might never sit under, he honored his daughter's life by ensuring beauty and shelter for generations he would never meet. As Earl moved into his late 60s, he began to see the farm not just as an individual enterprise, but as part of a larger community that spanned geography and time. He realized that the concept of community extended beyond his immediate neighbors. It included the soil microbes that broke down organic matter, the pollinators that made fruit set possible, the rivers that carried nutrients, and the consumers in faraway cities who relied on the food produced by farmers like him. This holistic understanding deepened his appreciation for the interconnectedness of all things. The local community was the most tangible aspect of this web. He had always known his neighbors by name, known their children, celebrated weddings, mourned funerals, and stood side by side in church pews. Over the years, the faces changed. Some neighbors retired and moved to town. New families bought farms. Immigrant workers arrived to work in nearby meatpacking plants. Earl took time to meet them, to learn their stories, to share his own. He discovered that despite differences in language or tradition, they shared common values. A desire to provide for their families, a willingness to work hard, a respect for land. He attended a quinceañera, tasted dishes he had never heard of, and saw his granddaughter play with children whose parents had grown up in entirely different countries. He realized that community was enriched, not threatened by diversity. The farming community extended beyond county lines. Earl joined cooperatives that marketed grains and livestock. He attended state farming conferences where he exchanged ideas with farmers from across the region. He visited farms in other states to see how they managed irrigation or livestock housing. These connections broadened his perspective and offered solutions to challenges he thought were unique. He learned that farmers in Kansas were experimenting with prairie restoration to combat soil erosion. He visited a dairy in Wisconsin where they implemented rotational grazing that improved pasture health and cow well-being. Each conversation added to his knowledge bank and reinforced the idea that no one farmer had all the answers. Collaboration was not just beneficial, it was necessary. He also began to think about the global community. His crops were shipped to feed mills in Asia, his beef served in restaurants on the coasts. He followed news about trade policies and global climate patterns, not from an abstract sense of curiosity, but because he knew they directly affected his livelihood and the people who relied on his farm's output. When he read about drought in Africa causing famine, he donated to organizations providing aid, understanding that food security was a universal concern. He supported fair trade initiatives that sought to ensure that farmers in other countries received a fair price for their products. These actions might have seemed small, but they reflected a growing awareness that the community of this land was global and that his choices had ripples far beyond Iowa. The environmental community was perhaps the most profound realization. He learned about mycorrhizal fungi that formed symbiotic relationships with plant roots, exchanging nutrients and water in a dance that supported entire ecosystems. He read about pollinator declines and the importance of habitat corridors. He studied the impact of nitrogen runoff on waterways and adopted practices to reduce it. He understood that the health of his soil was linked to the health of the river downstream, which was linked to the health of the Gulf of Mexico. This perspective shifted his farming from a simple productivity focus to a stewardship focus. He installed buffer strips along creeks to filter runoff. He planted native prairie strips within fields to provide habitat for insects and birds. He reduced tillage to protect soil structure and sequester carbon. He explained these practices to his grandchildren, showing them insects and birds and explaining how their presence indicated a healthy system. Community also meant recognizing the unseen workers in the soil. He took a soil biology workshop and returned amazed by the number of organisms living in a handful of earth. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, all working to break down organic matter, cycle nutrients, and create soil structure. He began thinking of himself not as a solitary farmer, but as part of a team with billions of microscopic colleagues. He understood that when he applied chemicals, he was not just affecting weeds, but entire ecosystems. This awareness prompted him to adopt integrated pest management, using chemicals judiciously, introducing beneficial insects, and rotating crops to disrupt pest cycles. He found satisfaction in seeing increases in soil organic matter and earthworm counts, knowing that these indicated a thriving below-ground community. The community of the land included human-made institutions as well. Earl served on the board of his local cooperative, where he advocated for fair pricing and transparent policies. He volunteered at the county extension office, answering questions from new farmers and sharing what he had learned over decades. He participated in a mentorship program for beginning farmers, pairing with a young man who had recently returned from military service and wanted to start farming. He shared his story, including the mistakes, the financial pitfalls, the weather disasters, and the joys. He listened as this young man described his dreams and fears. Together, they walked Earl's fields, discussing cover crops and loans and the balance between innovation and caution. Earl realized that community was also about sharing wisdom to ensure that others did not have to repeat the same painful lessons. As his sense of community broadened, so did his understanding of responsibility. He began advocating for policies that supported small and medium-sized farms, that addressed climate change, that ensured access to health care in rural areas. He wrote letters to his representatives, attended town hall meetings, and invited politicians to tour his farm. He knew they often saw agriculture as numbers on a spreadsheet. He wanted them to see the people behind those numbers, to understand that decisions made in faraway offices impacted real families and real land. He encouraged his neighbors to vote, to speak up, to share their stories, understanding that democracy was strongest when more voices were heard. In this chapter of his life, Earl learned that community was not static. It was something built and maintained, requiring effort and intention. It was not always easy. Differences in politics or farming practices sometimes led to tension, but he found that listening with an open mind, asking questions instead of making assumptions, and finding common ground could bridge divides. He found that shared meals and shared work were powerful connectors. He found that empathy, imagining yourself in someone else's boots, was essential. The lessons of community were also reflected in his family. Earl and Anna's grandchildren began to take on roles on the farm during summers. They learned to drive tractors, to handle livestock, to fix fences. They also went to school and to sports practices and to theater rehearsals. They had interests beyond the farm, and Earl encouraged them. He told them that community meant supporting each other's dreams, even if they led away from the farm. He did not want his grandchildren to feel pressured to stay just because he had. He wanted them to feel the same freedom his father had given him, to choose their path. At the same time, he hoped they would take with them the values the farm had instilled: hard work, honesty, respect for the land, and a sense of community. One summer, his granddaughter organized a farm-to-table dinner in the barn to raise money for a local food bank. She invited neighbors, local chefs, and community members. Earl helped clean the barn, haul tables, and string lights. He watched as people who had never set foot on a farm sat among hay bales, eating food grown by local farmers, listening to stories about how those vegetables and meats were produced. He saw his granddaughter stand up and speak passionately about food insecurity and the importance of supporting local agriculture. He felt pride swell in his chest. This event was more than a fundraiser. It was a community builder. It brought together people from different backgrounds around a shared table. It reminded Earl that the farm could be a place of gathering and connection, not just production. At a fall harvest party, Earl looked around at the faces. His son, his daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, his neighbors from down the road, the young immigrant family who had moved in 2 years prior, the elderly farmer who had sold Earl his first quarter section, the county extension agent, the chef who had cooked at the fundraiser. They were laughing, passing dishes, telling stories. They were a living representation of the community of the land. Earl felt a deep peace in that moment. It was not the peace of quiet or solitude, but the peace of belonging, of knowing that he was part of something larger than himself. As this chapter drew to a close, Earl began to understand that his place on the land was defined not only by the soil under his boots, but by the relationships nurtured over decades. Community was not an abstract ideal, but a tangible network of support, shared knowledge, and shared responsibility. The land taught him that he was never truly alone. It connected him to his neighbors, to farmers in other states, to consumers around the world, to ecosystems unseen, and to generations yet unborn. He saw that his legacy would not be measured solely by yield or acreage, but by the strength of the community he helped foster. In cultivating the land, he had also cultivated relationships. In feeding the soil, he had fed conversations and collaborations. In stewarding his farm, he had contributed to the health of a broader community. These lessons in community were among the richest the land had taught him, rooted in the understanding that every field is part of a greater whole. As Earl approached the milestone of 50 years on the same soil, his thoughts turned more frequently to the concepts of faith, hope, and perseverance. These were words he had heard in church, read in his Bible, and used in everyday conversation, but over decades, they had taken on deep personal meanings tied directly to his life on the farm. He realized that these words were not abstract virtues, but practical tools for survival and growth. Faith for Earl was not simply religious belief, though his faith in God was central to his life. It was a broader trust in processes unseen and outcomes uncertain. Every spring, when he planted seeds into cool, dark earth, he exercised faith. He could not see those seeds germinate, but he trusted they would. He could not control the weather, but he trusted that with prayer, good management, and a bit of luck, enough rain would come. There were times when his faith was tested. Droughts stretched on longer than forecasts predicted. Markets crashed unexpectedly. Loved ones suffered illnesses. In those moments, faith meant believing that the story was not over, that time could bring healing, that efforts mattered even when immediate results were not visible. His faith in people was also profound. He trusted that his neighbors would help in times of need, just as he would help them. He trusted that his son would make decisions that honored the values of stewardship. He trusted that his grandchildren would find their way in a world very different from the one he grew up in. This trust was sometimes challenged. He saw relationships in his community fracture over politics. He saw farmers who broke conservation agreements. He saw family members struggle with addiction. Yet he chose to believe in the possibility of redemption and repair. That choice was an act of faith. Hope was the fuel that kept Earl working through difficulties. It was what made him plant again after a crop failure, what made him invest in new practices after years of conservative management, what made him believe that his grandchildren would find joy on the farm even if they eventually left. Hope for Earl was not naive optimism. It was grounded in experience. He had seen drought years followed by plentiful ones. He had seen markets recover. He had seen injured animals heal. Because he had lived through cycles of loss and renewal, his hope was realistic. He did not expect every year to be good, but he hoped that over the long term, things would balance out. Hope allowed him to look at a field flattened by hail and imagine the green of next year's crop. It allowed him to sit at his daughter's grave and hope that his actions could honor her memory. It allowed him to look at his granddaughter's activism and hope that the next generation would care for the land with passion and intelligence. Perseverance was the daily application of faith and hope. It was the decision to get out of bed at 4 a.m. to feed calves, even when his knees ached. It was the effort to replant a field destroyed by flooding. It was the determination to continue advocating for rural healthcare access, despite political setbacks. Perseverance meant doing the right thing repeatedly, not because it always paid off immediately, but because it was the foundation of long-term success and integrity. The land demanded perseverance. It did not reward laziness or shortcuts. If you neglected to maintain your equipment, it broke down in the middle of harvest. If you skipped rotating crops, your yields suffered. If you failed to pay attention to soil health, your fields became less productive over time. Perseverance meant doing small tasks faithfully, trusting that they mattered. It meant repairing a fence in the back pasture no one else would see. It meant picking up trash along the gravel road. It meant attending township meetings even when the discussions were tedious. Earl's faith, hope, and perseverance were tested when he faced his own health challenges. In his late 60s, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The diagnosis came during harvest, a time when there was little room for doctor's appointments or treatment schedules. He was stunned, not because he thought he was invincible, but because he had always been the one taking care of others. Now, he was the one needing care. Surgery and radiation treatments followed. The community he had invested in turned out to help. Neighbors harvested his fields. His son managed the cattle. Anna drove him to appointments, sat in waiting rooms, and brought him meals when his appetite was weak. His grandchildren visited, bringing drawings and jokes. Faith allowed him to trust his doctors. Hope allowed him to imagine life after treatment. Perseverance allowed him to endure fatigue and fear. The experience changed him. It made him more compassionate toward others dealing with illness. It made him appreciate the fragility of health and the importance of preventative care. It reinforced his belief in the importance of community support. It deepened his awareness of the passing of time. Lying in a hospital bed, he thought about fields he might not see to harvest, grandchildren he might not see graduate. He thought about the knowledge he had yet to pass on. He promised himself that if he recovered, he would share more, teach more, love more. The land would still be there, but he needed to ensure that his wisdom would not die with him. He recovered slowly. It was not a dramatic event, but a gradual return to strength. He began by supervising from the porch, then riding along in the truck, then helping with small tasks, and finally climbing back onto a tractor. Each step was a victory. Each breath of cold fall air was a gift. He felt a renewed sense of gratitude for the simple act of being alive, for the weight of soil in his hands, for the view of golden soybean fields under a blue sky. He understood that not everyone survived. He felt both humbled by the fragility of life and empowered by the opportunity to continue contributing. He thanked God, thanked his community, thanked the land. In the quiet moments after his recovery, Earl began to think about legacy. 50 years on the same soil meant more than just a number. It meant decades of decisions, relationships, joys and sorrows intertwined with the land. He wondered what his grandchildren would remember of him. He hoped they would recall sitting beside him on a tractor seat, listening to his stories. He hoped they would remember how he carefully checked fence lines, how he insisted on fixing things properly rather than taking shortcuts, how he greeted neighbors with warmth, how he prayed for rain, how he laughed at small joys even when times were hard. He wrote letters to each grandchild, telling them what he loved about them, what lessons he hoped they would carry. He encouraged them to pursue their passions, whether on the farm or beyond. He told them that faith, hope, and perseverance would serve them in any field, literal or metaphorical. He also considered his ethical legacy. He had always believed in honest dealings. He had never cheated on weight tickets or misrepresented a load of grain. He had honored contracts even when prices changed in his favor. He had paid his workers fairly. He had donated to those in need. He hoped that integrity would be part of how he was remembered. The land had taught him that taking shortcuts might offer temporary gain, but often led to long-term harm. He wanted his grandchildren to understand that reputation was built slowly, but could be damaged quickly. He knew they would face temptations in a world that often rewarded expediency. He wanted them to know that perseverance included persevering in doing what was right, especially when no one was watching. As he neared the 50th anniversary of his first planting on his own soil, Earl decided to mark the occasion, not with a party, but with an act of gratitude. He wrote a letter to his father, who had been gone for decades, expressing thanks for the opportunities and lessons he had been given. He wrote a letter to his daughter, telling her how much he missed her and how her memory lived on in the work he did and the love he gave. He wrote a letter to the land, acknowledging its generosity, apologizing for times he had taken it for granted, and committing to continued care. He read these letters under the big cottonwood tree near the creek as the sun set, feeling the presence of those he had loved and lost.
Someday this will all be yours, son.
Afterwards, he walked the farm. He started at the house, traced a path past the barns, through the pastures, along the creek and across the fields. He touched the soil with his hands, felt the grass brush against his legs, listened to the insects and birds, watched the colors of the sky change. Each step was a prayer of thanks. Each breath carried both memory and anticipation. He reflected on his faith and how it had carried him through doubts. He considered his hope and how it had fueled perseverance. He recognized that perseverance itself had been a form of faith and hope in action. He smiled, thinking of the years ahead, knowing that while his own time on the farm would one day end, the lessons he had learned would live on in the next generations. This chapter underscored that faith, hope, and perseverance were not just virtues, but essential elements of life on the land. The soil taught him these truths daily. Faith allowed him to plant seeds in uncertainty. Hope allowed him to imagine harvest. Perseverance allowed him to work through long days and long nights. Together, they formed a trifecta that had carried him through 50 years on the same soil. They would carry him until his last day. In his 50th year on the farm, Earl felt the soil itself had become an old friend and a wise teacher. He had spent more hours with his hands buried in earth than in any other pursuit. He had read books and attended conferences, but most of his knowledge came from direct contact, from digging his fingers into loam to check moisture, from watching earthworms wriggle in decomposing plant matter, from smelling soil after a rain. He had come to understand that soil was not inert, but alive with organisms and processes that formed the foundation of all terrestrial life. This realization filled him with awe and humility. One spring, his granddaughter brought home a school project about the soil food web. They sat at the kitchen table, looking at a diagram showing how bacteria, fungi, and microfauna interacted with plant roots. Earl recognized some terms and learned new ones. He saw how nematodes fed on bacteria and released nitrogen in plant-available forms, how fungi extended the root system, how arthropods broke down organic matter. He realized that his management decisions affected not just crops, but entire ecosystems. He explained to his granddaughter how plowing disrupted fungal networks, how chemical applications could harm beneficial microbes, how organic matter served as fuel for the soil food web. He took her to the field and dug up a shovel full of soil, holding it up close so she could see the threads of mycelium. They smelled it together, describing the scent as earthy and sweet. He told her that this smell was the smell of life, The soil taught him patience through its slow processes. He remembered when he first adopted no-till practices. The first year, the fields looked messy, with residue on the surface. Weeds were more troublesome, yields were flat. He was tempted to return to conventional tillage, but he persevered. By the third year, he began to see improvement in soil structure.
This will all be yours, son.
Water infiltrated more easily. Earthworms became more abundant. By the fifth year, yields improved and weed pressure decreased. This gradual improvement taught him to trust slow changes. It reminded him that quick fixes often came with hidden costs. The soil also taught him about complexity. A soil test might show adequate nutrient levels, but if the pH was off, those nutrients might not be available to plants. Compaction in one area could limit root growth, causing stress that looked like nutrient deficiency. A dry spell could reduce microbial activity, slowing nutrient cycling. Earl learned to look beyond surface symptoms to underlying causes. He dug pits to examine root development. He used soil probes to check compaction. He monitored soil moisture with sensors and with his own hands. The complexity of soil mirrored the complexity of life. Problems rarely had single causes. Solutions rarely were one-size-fits-all. Wisdom required investigation, patience, and a willingness to accept that you might never fully understand every variable. Another lesson from the soil was about generosity. Soil, when cared for, gave abundantly. It held nutrients, filtered water, anchored plants, supported biodiversity. It produced food that fed families and communities. It provided raw materials like clay for buildings and sand for concrete. It sequestered carbon, helping mitigate climate change. In its generosity, the soil asked for care. It needed protection from erosion, replenishment of organic matter, respectful management. This reciprocal relationship taught Earl that generosity was most sustainable when it was mutual. He applied this lesson in other areas of his life. He understood that giving to others worked best when combined with respect for their boundaries and needs. He learned that expecting the land to give endlessly without care led to depletion and collapse, just as expecting people to give without rest led to burnout. Generosity, he learned, was tied to stewardship. The soil had also taught him about secrets. He discovered arrowheads and fossils while plowing fields. Each artifact told a story about people and creatures who had existed long before him. He found the remnants of an old homestead under a stand of trees, including a rusted plow and pieces of china. He wondered about the family that had lived there, what joys and struggles they had experienced, why they left. These discoveries made him feel like a small part of a long continuum. He realized that the land had been shaped by countless hands before his and would continue to be shaped by hands after his. This perspective informed his decisions. He felt responsible not just to his father or his children, but to the unnamed farmers and gatherers who had walked these fields thousands of years before, and to those who would walk them thousands of years after. He saw himself as a link in a chain, grateful for the gifts of those before him and mindful of his duty to those after. Soil's wisdom extended to the idea of cycles. He observed that decomposition and growth were intertwined. Dead plant matter became humus, which fed new plants. Crop residues became food for earthworms, which aerated the soil and released nutrients. Life and death were not separate but part of a continuous cycle. This understanding helped him reconcile the loss of his father and daughter. He saw death not as an end but as part of a larger process. He saw that grief could lead to compassion, that letting go could make room for new relationships. He saw that the farm was full of endings and beginnings, from the death of a calf to the birth of a lamb. The soil taught him that clinging to any one moment prevented growth, letting residues decompose, letting fields rest, letting emotions flow. It all was part of maintaining health. In recognizing soil's teachings, Earl also saw the importance of observing rather than imposing. The best farmers, he realized, were excellent observers. They noticed subtle changes in leaf color, slight variations in soil texture, small differences in plant height. They walked their fields, not just drove through them. They paid attention to how water pooled or flowed. They listened to birdsong and insect chatter. Observing allowed them to respond appropriately. He applied this in his relationships. He tried to observe his wife's moods, his son's stress, his granddaughter's curiosity, without immediately reacting or judging. He learned that listening was a form of observation. It allowed you to respond to actual needs rather than assumed ones. The soil did not speak in words, but it communicated through texture, color, moisture, and smell. People, he found, communicated in similarly subtle ways. Wisdom lay in paying attention. This wisdom of the soil extended to humility. Soil, no matter how rich, could be blown away in a single storm if left uncovered. It could be compacted by heavy machinery. It could become toxic if chemicals were misused. It could be overworked and lose its structure. Seeing soil's vulnerability reminded Earl of his own. He knew that his health, his relationships, and his farm could deteriorate if not cared for. Humility kept him learning, kept him asking questions, kept him seeking help when needed. It prevented complacency. It reminded him that he did not own the land. He borrowed it. He managed it for a time, but ultimately it belonged to creation. This humility shaped his dealings with others. It made him kinder, more patient, more willing to admit mistakes. It allowed him to celebrate others' successes without feeling threatened, to learn from younger farmers without feeling diminished. On the 50th anniversary of his first solo planting, Earl held a small gathering in the field where he had planted soybeans at 10 years old. His family and a few close friends joined him. They walked the rows, just as he had with his father. His grandchildren asked questions. He pointed out different soil types, explained why the slope mattered, told stories of droughts and floods and bumper crops. He thanked the soil aloud for its teachings, aware that his voice was one among many that had spoken gratitude over these fields. He shared with his family the wisdom he had gleaned, to be patient like the soil, to give and receive generously, to respect complexity, to recognize cycles, to observe, to be humble. The chapter on the wisdom of the soil concluded with a sense of fullness. Earl felt that his relationship with the land had matured from dependence to partnership to companionship. He no longer saw soil as simply something to work, but as something to learn from. He felt a deep gratitude for having spent 50 years in conversation with it. He hoped that his grandchildren would continue this dialogue, bringing their own questions and insights, making new mistakes, and discovering new truths. The soil would continue to teach as long as there were hands willing to touch it and minds willing to listen. As Earl looked back on the 5 decades he had spent on the same soil, he realized that the land had taught him everything he needed to know about legacy and the importance of passing on wisdom. He understood that legacy was less about the acreage he would leave behind than about the values that would continue through the lives of those he had nurtured. Standing under the old cottonwood tree, he thought about how the dignity of work and the richness of community were threads woven into the fabric of his life. He remembered the long days spent repairing equipment, the nights spent praying for rain, the quiet moments watching the sunrise over frost-covered fields. Each of those moments was a lesson and a gift, not just for him, but for the generations that followed. Earl knew that he could not predict what his grandchildren would choose to do with their lives. He did not want to dictate their paths. Instead, he wanted to give them a foundation of stories, skills, and ethics that would guide them wherever they went. He told them about the satisfaction of finishing a job well done, the necessity of patience when waiting for crops to grow, the importance of helping neighbors without expecting anything in return. He reminded them that the land was both fragile and resilient, worthy of care and capable of renewal. In the end, his greatest lesson was that a meaningful life is built from consistent, honest work, grounded in faith and nourished by hope. He learned that legacy is created through daily choices, through the way you treat people and the land, and through the courage to face storms with grace. As he watched his family work together in the fields, he felt confident that the lessons of the land would live on. The soil under his boots held more than crops. It held the story of a man, his family, and a community bound by shared labor and love. That story, Earl knew, would continue long after his footprints had faded. He knew staying faithful to the soil had been a gift